Hello, this is Mike Kajardi, and this is my video presentation for Dr. Du's History of Modern China class. For this paper, I chose to cover the peasantry and the decisive role they played in the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War, and how Mao's realization of their revolutionary potential was what led him to succeed, where the CPC leaders that came before him had failed. The thesis of my paper is that due to the unique economic and social conditions of China, the rural peasantry were the key to the success of the CPC. Unlike the Russian Revolution that started in contemporary St. Petersburg and spread to rural areas in the Civil War, Mao recognized that the CPC needed to take the reverse approach and build a movement from the countryside and spreading into the city in the final days of the Civil War. What I essentially mean by this is that the early CPC was following the direction of the young Soviet Union in how to organize a revolutionary party, which makes a certain amount of sense. Even if you were to ignore the material support they were getting from the Comintern, they were the first country to ever have a successful socialist revolution. They had avoided the mistakes that led to Rosa Luxemburg's 1919 revolution in Germany being stamped out before they were able to hold any kind of real power, and had lasted far longer than the other revolutions that sprang off after the October Revolution, like the short-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic, which lasted all but 4 months in 1919. So in terms of models to follow for a socialist revolution, the Soviet Union was the clear example to go by. The problem with that is that the economic conditions of China were different enough from the Russian Empire that following the model too closely was not effective against the Kuomintang. The Russian Empire was less developed than its contemporaries like the British, French, and German empires, but it was developed enough to have a significant urban working class that could sustain a revolutionary movement in cities like Petrograd, whereas China had yet to recover from mismanagement under the Qing dynasty, sustained intervention from the European powers, and was still in the midst of its warlord era, and was not economically developed enough to have a significant urban working class, much less one that can overthrow a government. One of the earliest proponents of the CPC adopting a strategy that was less focused on the urban centers was Mao, and he was ultimately proven right when his strategy of building up political power in the countryside and then encircling the urban centers led to communist victory in 1949. So what I've done here is I've sort of grouped the sources together as they sort of dovetail into each other and support different aspects of my argument. For example, these two sources written by Mao, The Analysis of Classes in Chinese Society and Report on an Investigation of the Peasant Movement in Henan, are both about Mao's view of the revolutionary potential of the Chinese peasantry. The first source, Analysis of Classes in Chinese Society, is where Mao breaks down how China is not a traditional class society that Marx and Engels were writing about in their formulation of class struggle, where there was a bourgeoisie that owned the means of production and a proletariat who had to sell their labor to the bourgeoisie for a wage, but that a significant section of people in China were in the peasantry, and that the peasantry itself had its own stratification, where wealthier peasants owned enough land that they could hire farmhands to till the land for them, and they did not have to work. Some peasants owned land and had to work it themselves for their own food and then sell what was left. Some were only able to grow what they themselves ate, and then there were landless peasants who were the poorest among the peasantry. Mao covers each level of the strata and hypothesizes how likely members of each would be to side with the communists. The report on an investigation of the peasant movement in Henan is, as the title may suggest, Mao's assessment of the peasant movement taking place in Henan, how it's indicative of other peasant movements that were taking place at the time, and that the peasant movements should be supported by the communists. In the introduction of the report, Mao writes, "In a very short time, in China's central, southern, and northern provinces, several 100 million peasants will rise like a mighty storm, like a hurricane, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to hold it back. They will smash the trammels that bind them and rush forward along the road to liberation. They will sweep all the imperialists, warlords, corrupt officials, local tyrants, and evil gentry into the graves. Every revolutionary party and every revolutionary comrade will be put to the test, to be accepted or rejected as they decide. There are 3 alternatives: to march at their head and lead them, to trail behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, or to stand in their way and oppose them. Every Chinese is free to choose, but events will force you to make a choice quickly. This quote from the end of the introduction demonstrates the great potential that Mao saw in the peasantry for their ability to mobilize and change Chinese society. The timing of this report is indicative of the divide in tactics of city-to-country organizing versus country-to-city organizing that this paper will explore, as the report was published only 2 months before the Shanghai Massacre of 1927 that would begin Chiang Kai-shek's purging of communists from the Kuomintang, essentially ending the city-to-country approach the CPC had inherited from the Soviets. The next two sources are more directly concerned with the peasantry and their role within the Communist Revolution and in prior social movements in China's history, namely the Boxer Rebellion. The first-hand accounts of participants of the Boxer Rebellion from the first source have a common anecdote about one of the factions known as the Big Knife Society, led by a woman named Miss Han. The common thread in all of these stories is that they were able to hold a city until it started to rain, and then most of the peasants left and the Big Knife Society collapsed. The reason all of these peasants left when it started to rain was because the crops had to be attended to after the rain, and with no one else to attend it, they themselves had to return home and take care of the crops. What this demonstrates, for the sake of this essay, is it gives an example of a moment in Chinese history that the peasantry played a defining role in the outcome of mass rebellion. In this case, it demonstrated that the movement failed because they did not have the full support of the peasantry, or rather that the leadership of the Boxer Rebellion did not make the logistical considerations that they needed to build any kind of sustainable mass movement. This particular incident might have been avoided if, say, a third of the forces stayed behind to tend to the village's crops, but that didn't happen. They lost the support of the peasantry because they could not support the peasantry in return. The next source from the novel The Sun Shines Over the Sagan River is a portrayal of the Suku meetings where the peasants would publicly shame and humiliate the landlords, speak their long-standing grievances with the landlords, and make themselves criticized in front of the crowd in the best-case scenario, or be publicly beaten to the point of critical injury or death in the worst-case scenario. I find that these stories can be related back to the assessment that Mao made in the analysis of classes in Chinese society, where he said that these lower-class landowning peasants who were subsistence farming and borrowing at a loss to do so, or landless peasants who were worked to the bone, had the most revolutionary potential among the peasantry, as they had lost the most to the landlord class and had the most motive to rise up against them. Another source that was recommended to me by Dr. Du is the book Fan Shen, a documentary of revolution in a Chinese village by William Hinton. The book covers the Chinese Revolution by looking entirely at one village in Shaanxi in the later period of the Civil War around 1948. One of the aspects of the book that I think would be beneficial for my argument is digging into the process of how the CPC worked with the peasantry, which this book covers among many other things. Another aspect of this book I'm interested in are its non-fiction accounts of the Suku meetings described by Ding Ling in her novel mentioned earlier. Her novel was based in the reality of the revolution, but at the end of the day it is still fiction, so I wanted a more concrete-based telling of those events. One issue with the book, however, is that it is well over 600 pages, and I just don't have time to go through all of it, so based on what I'm looking for to support my thesis, I provided some chapters that cover what I'm looking for, chapters 3, 13, and 18. Now finally on this last slide, I put aspects of history relating to my thesis which I haven't quite found definitive sources to use. The first one I want to talk about is the Taiping Rebellion, which was an earlier popular uprising against the Chinese government that had support from rural peasants and also implemented land reform, so I thought it might be helpful to sort of view this as a precedent to the communist building up of power among the peasantry. And secondly, I wanted to take a bit of a closer look at the conditions of the Russian Revolution that was seen as a model to follow, like I talked about at the beginning of this video, and why exactly it was a mistake on the part of the early CPC to try and follow it in the conditions of China at the time. Okay, that is all for my presentation. I appreciate any and all feedback you send my way, and if there's anything I need to clarify, don't hesitate to ask. I hope you all do well on your finals and have a good winter break.